The right for same-sex couples to marry is coming very slowly now to Mexico, in much the same way that it did in the United States. Because right now it's only legal in Mexico City and some of the larger states, but President Enrique Peña Nieto has made it very clear that he not only is not going to pay for the stinking wall, but he also plans to see a nationwide measure to legalize same-sex marriage throughout the country. Now, I don't think Mexico is all that Catholic anymore, and yet the Catholic Church is still the strongest private institution in the country. So last Saturday, there was a huge demonstration by the Frente Nacional, the National Front for Family Values, in Celaya, Mexico. 11,000 people were marching down the street, carrying anti-gay banners and shouting slogans. And then this 12-year-old boy stepped out in the street, stretched out his arms to stop him. The media has reasonably avoided using his name. I mean, they shouldn't tell you the name of a kid, but a journalist did interview him and said when he was asked why he did it, it wasn't just a stunt. He said, "I have an uncle that's gay, and I am tired of people hating him." It's only been a week, but this little boy has already been compared to the iconic image of the Tank Man, who 27 years ago stepped out in front of Chinese tanks rolling into Tiananmen Square. Or Aisha Evans, the 35-year-old nurse and single mother who stood up to riot police earlier this year in Baton Rouge. In the early 1960s, when Martin Luther King was being arrested and jailed on a regular basis, my mother was willing to dismiss the whole civil rights movement for that reason alone. In her universe, good people obeyed the law. Bad people broke the law. There was no way in her evangelical Methodist worldview to allow for a righteous person to break the law, though that is exactly what Martin Luther King told us that we had to do. Today is one of those increasingly rare days when we began with a reading from the Bible. We read this famous text from the prophet Amos, who decried how people were just going along with culture, forgetting their values, forgetting what they say they believed in. They were just riding along with the marketplace. Amos was irritated by the fact that people who were Jewish were increasingly agitated about being told they couldn't do business on the Sabbath. You remember when we couldn't go shopping on a Sunday, that they couldn't bear the fact that they were being cheated out of the opportunity to make money. They were itching to open their shops. And Amos says to cheat people, selling what he said, the sweepings of the wheat. That is, they would sweep the floor and get the dust and whatever grain they dropped and put it in the bag and sell it as if it was all wheat. And I want to rescue a part of that language. When he accused the merchants of making the ephah small and the shekel great, what he's saying, the ephah was their measuring cup. You see, you're making the measuring cup small. And the reason, if you don't know it, the reason we have ridges on our larger coins was when coins were made of actual silver or gold, people would take a knife and kind of shave it around the outside and save a little bit of the gold or silver for themselves. And so after a whole lot of people had done that, the shekel might not be that big anymore. It had gotten kind of small. And so when they were selling, even though they're cheating you with a small measuring cup, they're saying this shekel's too small. They're weighing the shekel and saying, I want a big shekel for this diminished amount of product that I'm giving you. Basically just saying you're cheating the poor that have to come and buy their food. But that's how the market works in one way or another. The proposed trade agreement that's in the news these days, the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, has been criticized because it favors corporations over labor, and it does. And there's really two things in the world that amount for wealth. One is capital, and the other is labor. And so laws by governments oftentimes simply favor capital over labor until things get so out of kilter that labor can no longer survive, and that's when you get a revolution. But the TPP is a trade agreement largely believed to accelerate the growing gulf between the rich and the poor. President Obama favors it. He's trying his best to get it passed. Hillary Clinton helped to write it and described it as the gold standard of trade deals until this last election cycle, the nominating cycle, when pressure was put on her to distance herself from it. But when she chose a vice presidential running mate, Tim Kaine, he has made a reputation for himself in promoting trade deals. And so Tim Kaine was a huge supporter of the TPP until he was chosen to run as a vice presidential candidate. So I don't often place wagers on presidential elections or politics in general. The last time I actually put money on an election was in 1981. I bet someone $20 that in 4 years no one would admit they had ever voted for Ronald Reagan. So I haven't been inclined to bet on stuff much, but I would bet that right after the November elections, the TPP will be renamed. They'll act like they've changed it, and they will pass it. The power of corporations is behind it. And ultimately, elected officials, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, work for corporations and not for labor. On a recent public television interview with the Green Party candidate, Jill Stein, Dr. Stein spoke for over 15 minutes about all of the problems with the TPP. And if you're the kind of person that watches PBS News, you say, well, I didn't hear that. The reason you didn't hear it is because they edited it out. Anytime anyone is critical of the TPP, even on public television, it is edited out. You don't hear it being mentioned very often on commercial TV in the United States. Corporations have even gained editorial control of PBS. And they've done that by giving large donations to PBS and then wink, wink, nod, nod, you're not going to say anything that's critical of us. I don't expect much out of CNN these days, but last week Wolf Blitzer was interviewing my second least favorite senator from Kentucky, Rand Paul. And Paul was reasonably arguing, I don't get to say this very often, but Rand Paul was reasonably arguing that we need to stop providing weapons to Saudi Arabia since they are using those weapons to kill civilians in Yemen. And Wolf Blitzer asked him, but if we do that, it will cut our military budget, and people in the United States who manufacture those weapons will lose their jobs. And Paul could do very little than just stare at him in silence. So Wolf Blitzer added, so job losses in America are not a concern for you. Is that right, Senator Paul? You see how the culture, the market, gets into a flow, and people can't even question the sacredness of it. Wolf Blitzer has supposedly been a journalist for years. I haven't seen any evidence of that, but he claims to have been a journalist for many years. But there was no way to even get a glimmer of a challenge to the marketplace through his skull. Even if you're talking about arming a regime that is killing civilians, it still doesn't make sense if it would cost corporations profit. Here in our own state, people have been subjected to an increasingly militarized police force that we all remember the images when the protests broke out in Ferguson, Missouri. They literally rolled out military armored trucks with guys, policemen in riot gear on the top holding assault rifles, pointing the rifles at peaceful protesters in an attempt to provoke them into responding against them, and then they arrested them. And yet no officer was charged with a crime. That we've been taught to accept that the police can roll a tank down our street, point a loaded assault rifle at us as if we somehow deserved it, as if we were living in an occupied nation. Now, my mother would have looked at Aisha Evans and assumed the absolute worst because she was being handcuffed and arrested by riot police. The Catholic Church in Mexico thought that they were on the high moral ground, and they had 11,000 people marching down the street claiming to be pro-family when they were really just being anti-gay. And the only person that appeared to object was this one 12-year-old boy, little 12-year-old boy. Walked out and said to this powerful church what Aisha said to the police in Baton Rouge, what the tank man said to the government in China, what Martin Luther King Jr. said to the Birmingham police, that a moral person has an obligation to resist an immoral law. The first sin in the presence of oppression is the acceptance of being oppressed. Martin Luther King Jr. said that if you will stand up straight, no one can ride on your back. Now, you can hate slave owners all day long, but while wanting to own a slave is the first sin of slavery, surely the second sin is being willing to be enslaved. Now, I personally know some of the multimillionaires who own many of the local fast food restaurants that pay their workers poverty wages. I've served on community boards with them. I've sat at the Community Foundation meetings with them. I sat on the board of the Rainbow Network with them. One goes to the Christian Church in Republic, another goes to the Jewish Synagogue, another goes to Ridgecrest Baptist Church, another goes to First and Calvary Presbyterian. These are people who feel no conflict about becoming increasingly wealthy on the backs of people that they are paying a starvation wage to. And then they go and sit in a pew in a synagogue or in a Christian church, and they don't feel any conflict between what they're doing and their alleged faith. What they are doing is legal. It isn't moral. It isn't right. It isn't justifiable. But they don't know that. Their preachers don't tell them that. Their rabbis, their priests, their pastors, they don't tell them that. No one they listen to tells them that. I've published it. They don't listen to me. But who has not told them in any organized, public, and credible way is all of the employees that they're abusing. I understand they're afraid of losing their sorry jobs. They don't want to get their hours cut. They hope for some promotion that might ease the suffering of their poverty. They might go up from $8 an hour to $8.50 an hour, and that would make a difference in their lives. Crumbs from the table of the very wealthy. But I have to tell you that the rich will do what is legal until you insist that they do what is right. All of my life, I've heard the truism repeated, possession is 9/10 of the law. Well, it is, but who wrote the laws? We have a ridiculous tax code that allows the very wealthy people to pay almost nothing in taxes. As Warren Buffett has frequently said, his secretary pays a much higher effective tax rate than he does. That is, if you earn a salary from working at a job, you are taxed at a rate that is nearly twice of what a person who's earning their income from investments. Why are we punishing people for working? Why is a salary to be taxed at twice the rate of investment income? Why is it that the income of the working poor is more at risk than the income of the very wealthy? Well, who do you think wrote the laws? There wasn't some union of secretaries that went and said, you know, we want to pay more than Warren Buffett does because Warren Buffett's just that good looking. That's not how it happens. There are no lobbyists on Capitol Hill representing workers at McDonald's or Panera. There are, however, 3 lobbyists for every single elected official in Washington representing the pharmaceutical industry. There are huge armies of lobbyists that represent the military-industrial complex. And there are lobbyists that represent, you know, no one says that they work for the tobacco industry, but the companies that own cigarette companies also own food companies. And so they try, it's a basket of, I don't know if they're all deplorable, but close enough, I suppose. It's a basket of concerns so that John Boehner, who was Speaker of the House for years, can now go to work for a cigarette company. He's a longtime smoker, everybody has known that, but ostensibly the millions of dollars he's going to be paid is to help promote abstinence of smoking among kids. I don't know that anyone on earth is dumb enough to believe that, but that's what's being said. Those corporations that make huge contributions during election year are buying access to government. So they donate to both Republicans and Democrats, and they don't really care which side wins. I mean, you've heard Goldman Sachs bankers say, we're comfortable with either one. Because no matter who wins, they're still going to serve the interests of the corporation. So who does advocate for the oppressed? Now, what made it iconic about the Tank Man in Tiananmen Square was that he was unknown. He's still unknown. People have tried to figure out who he was, and the best you can get out of one Chinese diplomat said, "He not dead yet." So that just means they haven't found him yet, but we don't know who he is. He was just some guy who had been grocery shopping. We've got a picture of him out here in the hallway. Go look closely. He's still carrying his grocery bags. He had not planned to walk out in front of a tank in Tiananmen Square. He simply walked into the square with a conscience, saw what was happening, and walked out and stopped it. It took several days for the media to find out who Aisha Evans was. She wasn't a pastor. She wasn't a politician. She wasn't a community organizer. She was a single mom, a nurse. She had never been to a demonstration before in her life. She's from New York. She flew down to Louisiana to be a part of this demonstration and saw how the police were abusing their power, and she just walked her little self right out into the street and stood up to all these guys that were marching on her and was arrested. And as happens in many cases, if you just looked at the moment, she got handcuffed and carried away to jail. Looks like power won. But immediately, the public's attitude towards this heavily militarized police in Baton Rouge changed. Policing changed because this one 30-something nurse decided, I'm not going to let this pass. This little 12-year-old boy in Mexico, and it hasn't been in American media. I find out about these things by my addiction to news podcasts, but he stepped out into the street and stopped a procession of 11,000 self-righteous Catholics. Now, he didn't get to stay in the street. He was pulled out and the march continued. But you know what? I guarantee you, gay people are going to get their civil rights in Mexico. And they won't get their civil rights because the Catholic Church decides to do the right thing. Because we all know they're not going to do the right thing. But Mexico will do the right thing because of the courage of this little boy and people like him who just won't let the state continue to hate their uncles and their sisters and their neighbors whom they love. We need to be able to recognize a prophet when we see one. The prophets who shake us out of our complacency, the ones who sometimes embarrass us because they had the presence of mind to step out in front of the tank or in front of the riot police or in front of a whole bigoted church while we were just watching from the sidelines, while we were just playing along, saying nothing ever matters, nothing ever changes, nothing we can do. We need to be able to recognize our prophets and not just adore them, but follow them off of the curb into the streets. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed." You know that's true. Freedom is never just granted by the oppressor. The oppressed have to demand it. We didn't end slavery because slave owners figured out that slavery was wrong. We didn't end child labor because the textile industry realized, all these kids are getting injured, this is wrong, we need to stop this. We stopped it when the culture demanded a change and enacted it in laws. Now, a couple of years ago, we tried to to join in a labor union organized demonstration in front of a McDonald's. We picked a McDonald's up on Kearney on the north side of town. And labor union organizers came to town for 2 months, going around to fast food places around town, talking to employees, trying to get them involved in staging a big demonstration. And the day of the demonstration came, not a single fast food worker actually showed up. They're scared. So there were about a dozen church folk. I was the youngest one there, carrying signs in front of a McDonald's. 8 patrol cars and a paddy wagon showed up in 5 minutes. There have not been 8 police cars on the north side of Springfield for anything, ever. Not for domestic violence, not for a shooting incident, not for murder, not for child abuse. You couldn't get 8 patrol cars to the north side of town if Krispy Kreme was giving away free donuts. Don't forget that day that we experienced ourselves. The government in our community and in cities across America serve the profit interests of corporations, not the people. You couldn't have gotten those people, those police there for anything other than a threat to profit. If we had actually had enough people there to slow down the service at the drive-thru so that people had to wait for their Egg McMuffin, we could have made a point. We could have. But we only had about a dozen people. If we'd had 200 of us out that morning, it would have been different. If there had been 2,000, then the owners of McDonald's would start to squirm in their pews in the Christian churches that they attend. They will do what is legal for as long as they can. When they believe that we won't tolerate their abuse any longer, they'll decide to do what is right. And it is up to us to decide how much longer that's going to take.
Amen.
You have been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at Reverend Dr. Ray at AOL.com for more information.